For the last few decades, Argentina has been a serial defaulter on its government bonds, and yet, in the last few years, Argentina was still able to sell long duration bonds that people knew, anyone with common sense, anyone with rationality, anyone who actually studied their track record knew that within a few years there would be problems, there would be defaults, they'd be trying to restructure, and that is exactly what has happened. And yet now, many governments, the US is even thinking about it, and corporations are considering selling 30-year, 50-year, and even 100-year bonds. So this is ridiculous, but I'm not surprised anymore because of the debt Ponzi scheme, and it's being over 270 trillion. It mathematically cannot be paid back. Investors are desperate for income. I've heard this now since before the pandemic. People are always looking for dividend stocks or rental properties, although now with the pandemic, rental properties are here in the US, who knows what the future is with politicians who are some politicians who are talking about ending rent payments and ending mortgage payments. So who knows about that? But my main point, though, is that people are desperate for income, and bond investors are definitely part of that. And then you have central banks subsidizing with artificially cheap interest rates and then creating currency units out of thin air to subsidize big government and buying all these bonds. So you have either governments planning on issuing large amounts of super long duration bonds, bond investors desperate for income, and then governments and large corporations taking advantage of this debt Ponzi scheme, and then taking advantage of Japanification and central banks manipulating interest rates lower, capping them with Japanification, financial repression, and yield curve control. And this is part of stagflate tax lie, because the ultimate goal, because these politicians and bureaucrats and senior C-level executives of these large corporations, they're not going to be around running these governments or corporations 30, 50, 100 years from now. The ultimate goal is to keep this game of musical chairs, to keep this Ponzi scheme, this debt Ponzi scheme, growing. And that is how you do it. You do it by inflating the debt away, stagflate tax lie, manipulating interest rates lower, and then rolling over existing debt that governments and large corporations cannot mathematically pay back, and then issuing new debt in larger amounts. This is a perfect case study for what these governments are either doing already or considering doing. And the European Central Bank is a prime example of this, as they're already on the hook to buy 85% of net debt issuances in 2021. And the year has basically just started. We're not even 2 full months into the year, and the European Central Bank is already on the hook to buy an enormous amount of government bonds that are going to be issued. And then you have desperate bond investors and bond fund managers and pension funds desperate for a little bit more income, who are looking at those longer duration bonds that some of these governments, because bond prices are artificially propped up, artificially manipulated high with this bond selling scheme that I've been talking about for months. And it's a very complicated bond selling scheme involving central banks, ratings agencies, Wall Street, and large banks that are bond salespeople make enormous commissions, and the banks make enormous profits selling bonds and trading bonds and front-running central banks, and the hedge funds make profits off this too. And everyone's looking for income or profits from bonds. And then the beneficiary of this is not the investor looking for income, because the risk that they are taking, the inflation risk, is not being priced in. Because 30, 50, 100 years, some of these bonds are going to be worthless. Heck, they might even be defaulted on, because you're starting to see these governments copy Argentina now. And corporations are even talking about it. There's even a number of large corporations considering issuing 30, 50, maybe even 100-year bonds, if they can get away with it. And that debt will be inflated away, regardless of what the consumer price index or the phony government economic data says. This is how the debt Ponzi scheme goes from 270 trillion to 300 trillion to 350 trillion to 400 trillion potentially. Although we'll see what happens with a great reset and government cryptocurrencies. We'll see what happens with that. But the plan is to keep this debt Ponzi scheme growing and growing and growing. But there's no cash flow to service the debt in a lot of cases. And there's definitely not cash flow to pay back the debt. and yet the debt is growing and growing. And that's how these governments and large corporations are able to keep issuing new debt, is the desperation for income. They prop up the bond prices with this bond selling scheme, and then the central banks create currency units out of thin air to monetize a good amount of this debt, like what the European Central Bank is doing. And then you have the Federal Reserve, which is going to be copying the European Central Bank in the not too distant future. And this scheme is going to go on and on as long as it can. And the system collapsed in 2008. There was no real recovery. The system totally collapsed. Tens of trillions, if not 100 trillion or more, of new currency and credit were created out of thin air to fake a recovery in 2008. And here we are, over 270 trillion, and things are even worse. The wealth disparity is even worse. We have enormous distortions in asset prices, and the average Joe or Jane on Main Street is pissed off. And they're voting with their money. They're buying a lot of risky stocks. They're gambling in the casino. The one good thing I think they're doing, thankfully, is they're buying physical silver. They're opting out of the system. They're not holding enormous amounts of currency units. They're starting to buy physical silver, at least here in the US. So this bond selling scheme is starting to get to Argentina levels. And Argentina is a serial defaulter, so these governments may not default overtly. The normal covert way for governments, historically speaking, to default is with inflation, devaluing the currency, monetizing government debt, and what I call stagflate tax lie, because they're going to lie about the real inflation rate. The average Joe or Jane on Main Street knows that their standard of living is falling unless they grow their income, and their bills and cost of living are going up for everyday things like food, healthcare. Before the pandemic, rent was going up. So a lot of those things for everyday expenses just to survive, to maintain your standard of living, were all increasing. And politicians are still talking about raising taxes despite politicians and bureaucrats destroying the economy, not allowing businesses to open, not even giving the small business owner a chance to fight to survive. Meanwhile, governments and large corporations can sell almost as much debt as they please.